Amid the endless convoys of World War II, one small vehicle stood out, a Jeep bearing a red cross on its hood. It wasn't a standard ambulance, but an ordinary Willys MB, modified by soldiers in the field. With scraps of pipe canvas and metal, they built makeshift stretchers and simple covers. These unofficial field ambulances had no serial numbers and no formal approval, yet they carried thousands of wounded men from the front lines to aid stations, where every minute meant the difference between life and death. In the chaos of the Second World War, the roads themselves became battlegrounds. They were not smooth highways, but rivers of mud, carved by the endless weight of convoys, tracked vehicles, and retreating artillery. Along these scarred routes, one small silhouette appeared again and again, a squat, open Jeep bearing a hastily painted red cross. It was not a standard ambulance, nor did it belong to any medical unit's official roster. It was a Willys MB, a light reconnaissance vehicle that had already carried ammunition, mail, and officers through every kind of terrain imaginable. But in the hands of field mechanics and medics, it had been reborn as something far more vital. The men who built these makeshift ambulances were not engineers by training. They were soldiers with grease-stained hands and limited tools, stationed in workshops improvised from wreckage and tents. They scavenged whatever they could find: steel pipes from damaged trucks, canvas torn from tents, seat belts from wrecked aircraft, and turned them into stretchers, frames, and shelters. What emerged was a crude but effective hybrid. A Jeep capable of carrying 2 wounded soldiers, one over the hood and another behind the driver, strapped securely to metal braces. It was noisy, exposed, and dangerous, yet it moved across terrain that no truck could cross. By the winter of 1944, as the Allied advance pushed through the forests of France and into the Ardennes, these converted Jeeps became an unofficial lifeline. The terrain was treacherous, the weather bitter, and the larger medical trucks, the standard Dodge WC-54S, could not always reach the forward lines. When shells cratered the roads or snow buried supply routes, the little Jeeps pressed on. Their engines sputtered, their tires slipped, but they carried the wounded away from the sound of artillery toward the faint promise of a medical tent and morphine. No factory had designed them, and no manual described them. Each was unique, shaped by the hands of the men who needed it most. Some had frames welded from spare gun mounts. Others used the bent tubing of aircraft fuselages or steel rods taken from bridge repair kits. A few even carried hand-painted signs reading ambulance, though the paint was often washed away by rain or coated in dust within days. Despite their improvised nature, these vehicles formed an invisible network across the battlefields, small, determined machines connecting chaos to care. They had no serial numbers, no records, and no official photographs in command reports. Many were destroyed before the end of the campaign, scrapped for parts, or abandoned once the regular supply lines reopened. But to the medics and soldiers who rode in them, they were miracles of necessity, fragments of metal that gave life where the army had provided none. When a wounded man was lifted from a trench and laid across the hood of a Jeep, he might still be bleeding, freezing, and terrified, but for the first time since the explosion or gunfire, he was moving away from death. That motion itself became hope. Across Europe and the Pacific, the sight of a small olive-drab Jeep bouncing through mud with a red cross fluttering in the wind became a quiet symbol of persistence. It was proof that even amid industrialized destruction, human ingenuity could still serve compassion. The Willys MB had been built to support war, yet on countless roads, from the jungles of New Guinea to the ruined villages of France, it found another purpose. The same machine that once carried rifles and radios now carried lives, and in doing so, it transformed not only the battlefield, but the meaning of what a machine could be. By late 1944, the war had reached a pace that strained every system the Allied armies had built to sustain themselves. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles across Europe and the Pacific, and the machinery of war, trucks, tanks, and aircraft, consumed fuel, parts, and manpower faster than it could be replenished. Amid this vast logistical effort, one of the most fragile links in the chain was medical evacuation. The U.S. Army Medical Department had developed an organized system of field hospitals and evacuation routes, but it depended on vehicles that could not always reach the wounded in time. The standard ambulance, the Dodge WC-54, was effective on solid roads, yet was heavy, large, and ill-suited for front-line terrain. On the muddy tracks of France, the frozen paths of the Ardennes, or the jungles of the Pacific, it simply could not go where men were falling. The forward medical posts, known as aid stations, were often positioned only a few hundred meters behind the line. There, under shell fire and constant movement, medics treated the wounded and waited for ambulances that sometimes never arrived. Roads were cratered, bridges blown, and convoys delayed by enemy attacks or weather. In some areas, especially during the winter campaign in Belgium, vehicles sank up to their axles in mud. When the Battle of the Bulge began in December 1944, freezing rain and snow turned the countryside into a morass where trucks were useless. Even jeeps struggled, but they were light enough to be pulled, or repaired quickly. The men on the ground began to realize that if the official system could not reach them, they would have to build their own. The problem was not simply mechanical, it was structural. Medical evacuation was designed around predictability. A network of rear hospitals, collection point, and transport columns, but battle rarely followed those lines. Advances happened faster than the medical corps could reposition, and retreat often meant abandoning equipment. In the Pacific, conditions were even harsher. On islands like Guadalcanal or Peleliu, the heat destroyed engines, rain washed out every road, and dense vegetation limited vehicle movement to narrow trails. Litter bearers, men carrying stretchers on foot, remained the primary method of evacuation, but they were slow, vulnerable, and exhausted. Many wounded soldiers died within sight of their units, simply because there was no way to move them to safety. The shortage of dedicated ambulances was compounded by the destruction of vehicles in combat. German artillery and aircraft routinely targeted road junctions and convoys, knowing that hitting a single transport column could cripple an entire division's mobility. Replacing a lost ambulance required a long supply chain stretching back to Britain or the United States, and in the meantime, field hospitals had to improvise. Mechanics scavenged parts from burnout trucks and jeeps, creating crude hybrids that could at least pull a stretcher trailer or carry the wounded over short distances. Fatigue and despair began to creep into the medical units. Reports from the European theater in late 1944 described situations where doctors and corpsmen carried wounded men to the mud on doors or makeshift sleds. In some regiments, soldiers volunteered to carry stretchers themselves after dark, taking turns through the night until exhaustion forced them to stop. Even when evacuation succeeded, it was rarely smooth. Ambulances that did make it to front often returned with broken axles, destroyed tires, or jammed engines. Spare parts were scarce, and fuel was rationed. The problem reached its peak during the fast-paced advances of General Patton's Third Army, where units moved faster than their logistical support. Medics found themselves caring for wounded in temporary shelters, while supply columns were still 50 miles behind. The system that had worked in North Africa and Italy was breaking down under the demands of a continental campaign. The Army's ability to save lives no longer depended solely on surgeons or hospitals, but on whether a functioning vehicle could traverse a ruined road under fire. In these conditions, the medical corps had to rethink its priorities. The idea of a perfect ambulance, large, well-equipped, and comfortable, gave way to the necessity of something smaller, faster, and disposable. Mechanics began modifying the vehicles they had, stripping jeeps of unnecessary weight, welding frames for stretchers, and turning them into miniature ambulances. They were ugly, uncomfortable, and often unsafe, but they worked. The problem of evacuation under fire had forced an evolution not born from design bureaus or factories, but from the dirt floors of field workshops. It was the moment when survival itself became an act of engineering. The Willys MB and its near-identical counterpart, the Ford GPW, were born out of urgency. In 1940, as Europe burned and the United States prepared for the possibility of war, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps issued a call for a light reconnaissance vehicle that could replace the motorcycle and the sidecar. The requirements were exacting. It had to carry 4 men, mount a machine gun, climb steep grades, be under 1,300 pounds, and be delivered in record time. Out of the companies that responded, the Willys Overland design ultimately prevailed, combining power, simplicity, and ruggedness. By the end of the war, over 600,000 Jeeps had been produced by Willys, and Ford combined, making the MB and GPW some of the most recognizable and widely used vehicles in military history. The strength of the Jeep did not lie in its armor or firepower, but in its adaptability. Its ladder-frame chassis, four-wheel drive, and flathead four-cylinder engine made it light, maneuverable, and easy to repair. Every bolt, every bracket was standardized, allowing soldiers to interchange parts between models and repair damage even in primitive field conditions. The vehicle's minimal design meant that it could be stripped, rebuilt, or modified with minimal tools. For the first time in military logistics, the front line had a machine that was both universal and democratized. Any unit, from infantry to engineers, could adapt it for their needs. As early as 1942, reports from North Africa and the Pacific described improvised Jeep conversions for reconnaissance, supply, and medical evacuation. The official U.S. Army medical vehicle at the time, the Dodge WC-54, was reliable but large, and its 3/4-ton frame limited its reach in forward zones. Jeeps began to fill the gap. Field workshops and engineers in the European and Pacific theaters began experimenting with the idea of mounting stretchers on the compact frames. The simplest modifications consisted of two metal poles or tubular supports fixed above the front fenders and rear panel, allowing one or two wounded soldiers to be strapped horizontally across the vehicle. Canvas strips or wooden slats were used to stabilize the stretchers. These early conversions were not formally sanctioned but soon gained informal acceptance. Medics and mechanics sent photographs and field notes back to the U.S. Army Medical Department, documenting how the modifications performed under fire. The success of these experiments caught the attention of Army engineers, who began designing standardized kits that could be installed on any Jeep without permanent alteration. By mid-1943, various designs were circulating through both American and British units, each adapted to local conditions. Some had vertical mounts that held a stretcher over the hood. Others used lateral brackets for loading from the side. In the Pacific Theater, the need for flexibility was even more urgent. The terrain of the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Philippines made large ambulances nearly useless. Jeeps became the default evacuation transport, carrying wounded men over jungle trails, coral paths, and river crossings. Australian workshops, particularly those operated by General Motors Holden in Melbourne, began producing semi-official Jeep ambulance conversions for the U.S. Marine Corps. These vehicles featured elongated rear bodies and covered compartments that offered some protection from the tropical elements. They were used extensively on Guadalcanal and later in Bougainville and the Marianas campaigns, setting an early example of how a field innovation could evolve into a manufactured solution. In Europe, similar patterns emerged. British airborne and commando units, constrained by airlift limitations, adopted the Jeep as their primary light vehicle. They modified them for every conceivable task: gun carriers, ammunition haulers, and medical transports. The Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REAM, developed quick-fit stretcher brackets that could be attached to any Jeep in under 15 minutes. American divisions soon copied the concept. Manuals such as TM9 to 803, the official Jeep Operator's Guide, began including appendices referencing field adaptations, even though these were not standard issue. By 1944, the Jeep had become more than a vehicle. It was a modular platform. Soldiers mounted radios, flamethrowers, water pumps, and winches on it. For the medical corps, it was a blank canvas that could be transformed within hours to meet the needs of the wounded. The combination of mobility, simplicity, and abundance made it the most logical foundation for improvised ambulances. Units could cannibalize damaged vehicles for frames, engines, or suspension parts and rebuild them under canvas tents or in open fields. The Jeep's symbolic role also grew. To the Allied soldier, it represented self-reliance and versatility, a machine that could be trusted to do anything. From the deserts of Tunisia to the beaches of Normandy, it proved that engineering ingenuity could overcome logistical chaos. It was this very universality that allowed mechanics and medics, facing shortages and impossible conditions, to reimagine it as an ambulance. In a war dominated by massive tanks and bombers, the Willys M.B. stood as the smallest, simplest reminder that survival often depended on what could be built from the parts that remained. The turning point came not from an order or a directive, but from necessity pressing against survival. By 1943, the Allied campaigns in multiple theaters had exposed a fundamental weakness of the Army's medical evacuation system: It was designed for predictable terrain and organized fronts, but modern warfare no longer had either. The advance from Sicily into mainland Italy revealed the limits of heavy vehicles. The mountain passes of the Apennines and the narrow, bomb-damaged village roads made it nearly impossible for standard ambulances to reach the wounded. During the battles near Monte Cassino, medics were forced to carry stretchers up steep mule paths under enemy fire. Jeeps, small and agile, became the only machines capable of moving to the debris-strewn routes. What began as improvisation soon became a lifeline. In the Pacific, the story repeated itself under different skies. On New Guinea and Bougainville, torrential rain and dense jungle turned every road into a swamp. The Dodge WC-54S bogged down within minutes, while Jeeps could be manhandled through narrow clearings or driven over makeshift bridges of palm trunks. American and Australian field workshops began modifying their Jeeps specifically for evacuation. The earliest versions were little more than stripped-down vehicles with planks attached to hold stretchers, but within months, patterns began to emerge. Medics discovered that positioning one stretcher over the hood balanced the vehicle's weight, while another could be secured behind the driver. The design was crude, yet it worked, and crucially, it could be built in a single day using scrap metal and canvas. The human catalyst was desperation. The casualty rates in Italy, France, and the Pacific Islands were staggering. Every offensive left thousands wounded, and the front moved faster than the medical corps could relocate its equipment. The pressure on field medics was immense. They watched men die not from fatal wounds, but from delays in evacuation. The official channels for vehicle requests moved too slowly, bogged down by supply bureaucracy. So they stopped asking. Mechanics, often working under canvas tents by candlelight, began welding their own frames and fabricating brackets for stretchers. Some used aircraft tubing salvaged from downed planes. Others repurposed steel rods from Bailey Bridge components. Every Jeep that rolled off their line was unique, but each carried the same unspoken mission, to give the wounded a chance to reach a surgeon alive. In Northwest Europe, the problem intensified during the breakout from Normandy and the subsequent push through France. Villages were reduced to rubble, and bridges were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Convoys of medical trucks lagged behind the armored spearheads. Forward aid stations had no dedicated transport, forcing medics to depend on whatever vehicle was available. In these circumstances, the Jeep became indispensable. Field reports from the Third Army in 1944 describe entire medical platoons equipped with nothing but modified Jeeps for frontline evacuation. A standard Jeep could carry 2 lying and 1 sitting casualty, allowing a single driver to move 3 men, where previously it had taken a team of litter bearers hours to cover the same ground. The success of these conversions did not go unnoticed. By mid-1944, the U.S. Army Medical Department began circulating field memos acknowledging the widespread use of Jeep litter carriers. The document stopped short of official approval but included recommendations for safe mounting, balance, and field fabrication. What had begun as an unregulated improvisation was slowly becoming institutionalized. British and Canadian engineers developed their own kits, compatible with both the Willys MB and Ford GPW, using standardized tubing that could be installed in 15 minutes. The innovation spread laterally, from one mechanic to another, from one theater to the next, faster than any supply order could travel. The Italian and Pacific campaigns provided further validation. On the Anzio beachhead, Jeeps ferried wounded across exposed sands under constant artillery fire, where larger vehicles would have been destroyed instantly. In the jungles of the Solomon Islands, Jeep ambulances carried Marines through flooded trails, their engines half submerged, their stretchers covered in tarps to protect against the rain. Each successful evacuation reinforced a lesson. Mobility was the only medicine that mattered in the field. By late 1944, the adaptation had become so widespread that the medical corps could no longer treat it as improvisation. Manuals began to include references to the field-modified Jeep ambulance, and officers quietly encouraged units to construct them when regular ambulances were unavailable. What had started as an act of desperation, mechanics scavenging parts in the mud, evolved into a doctrine of necessity. The Jeep, designed as a symbol of mobility and versatility, had found a new purpose to the hands of the men who refused to let their wounded be left behind. This moment marked a subtle but profound shift in military thinking. The front line no longer depended solely on orders from above, but on the ingenuity of those at the bottom. Each improvised ambulance was a small act of rebellion against the limits of logistics, proof that in modern war, survival favored those who could build their own solutions. The creation of the stretcher Jeep was never standardized in blueprints or manuals. It was born from a patchwork of field experiments, improvisation, and necessity. Each vehicle was a reflection of the materials available, the terrain it served in, and the ingenuity of the soldiers who built it. The process typically began in a maintenance yard or a field workshop, often no more than a tent filled with scavenged tools and the burned-out remains of vehicles. Mechanics started by stripping a Willys MB or Ford GPW down to its essentials, removing the rear seat, side rails, and sometimes even the windshield. What remained was a flat platform and a sturdy frame, ready to be transformed from a fighting vehicle into a tool of rescue. The most common pattern that emerged among Allied units became known as a stretcher Jeep or Jeep litter carrier. It could carry 2 litter patients lying flat and one sitting casualty beside the driver. To achieve this, mechanics built 2 horizontal stretcher racks, one placed over the hood and another extending over the rear of the vehicle. The front rack was usually fixed to the front bumper and windshield brackets, while the rear one rested on tubular supports bolted to the rear fenders or welded to the body. These supports were made from whatever metal could be found: sections of gas pipe, cut-down tent poles, aircraft tubing, or even salvage gun mounts. In some British and Canadian units, specially fabricated fittings were issued that allowed a stretcher frame to be attached without permanent alteration to the Jeep structure. The stretchers themselves were standard issue U.S. Army litters, made of aluminum poles and heavy canvas. They could be locked into place with simple clamps or leather straps. Field modifications often included rubber pads or webbing loops to reduce vibration. In some cases, aircraft seat belts were used as improvised shock absorbers. To protect the wounded from mud, rain, or dust, a lightweight canopy was sometimes stretched across the racks, supported by bent metal rods and covered with tent canvas or tarpaulin. This rudimentary roof gave the Jeep its recognizable silhouette, a small, boxy outline with a red cross painted on the side or front panel. Space inside the vehicle was limited, so every inch had to serve a purpose. The driver sat in his usual position, but the co-driver's seat was often removed to make room for medical equipment: morphine kits, plasma bottles, dressings, and splints. Some units fixed a small wooden box between the driver's seat and dashboard for medical instruments or spare bandages. In mountain or jungle operations, Jeeps were fitted with wider tires or chained wheels to improve traction, and exhausts were raised to avoid flooding during river crossings. The transformation could be completed astonishingly fast. A skilled team of 2 or 3 mechanics could convert a damaged or spare Jeep into an ambulance in under 8 hours. They used hand tools, field welders, and the most common wartime resource: creativity. When metal was scarce, wooden beams were used to brace the stretcher racks. When welding equipment was unavailable, holes were drilled and fastened with bolts salvaged from broken vehicles. The simplicity of the Jeep's design made it an ideal canvas for this kind of adaptation. Despite their crude construction, these vehicles were surprisingly durable. Reports from the European theater described Jeeps carrying wounded over 20 miles of rough terrain without structural failure. In the Pacific, where the heat and humidity corroded everything, some units coated the metal supports with grease or wrapped them in canvas to slow rust. Maintenance was constant. Every mission left the vehicles covered in mud, dented, and strained, but their reliability earned them deep respect among the medical corps. There were regional variations in design, shaped by local conditions. The U.S. Army's engineers in France favored open-top Jeeps with quick-release stretcher fittings for rapid loading under fire. In contrast, the Australian-made Holden Jeep ambulances featured enclosed rear compartments and slightly lengthened bodies, better suited to tropical weather and long-distance transport. The British Ream workshops added removable side shields of plywood or thin steel to protect against debris and small arms fire. In some cases, units painted their makeshift ambulances white with red crosses, though more often they retained the olive drab to avoid standing out to enemy aircraft. Every completed stretcher Jeep carried the mark of improvisation. No 2 were alike, and none would have passed a factory inspection. but they all fulfilled the same purpose, bridging the gap between the battlefield and the surgeon's table. Each bolt, strap, and weld embodied a moment of necessity, a calculation made under pressure, how to save more lives with fewer resources. In this way, the process of construction became an act of silent defiance against the limits of war. These vehicles were not built for glory or recognition, but for survival. They were machines assembled from fragments of destruction, repurposed to carry the most fragile cargo of all, human life. The true test of the stretcher Jeep came not in workshops or training camps, but on the shattered landscapes of active war zones. From the beaches of the Pacific to the snowbound roads of Europe, these improvised ambulances faced the same dangers as the men they carried. They moved through shellfire, mud, and jungle, often with no escort or protection, driven by soldiers whose mission was not to fight, but to retrieve. Their performance under those conditions determined whether the idea of a light, frontline ambulance would endure or vanish as another failed experiment of necessity. In the Pacific Theater, the stretcher Jeep found its first sustained use. The U.S. Marine Corps quickly realized that the rugged terrain of Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and New Guinea rendered heavy medical trucks useless. Narrow jungle trails and deep mud swallowed anything larger than a Jeep. Australian and American mechanics began building ambulance variants almost immediately, welding frames and fabricating mounts from whatever materials could be found. Some of these conversions were so successful that the U.S. Marine Corps commissioned General Motors Holden in Melbourne to build small runs of purpose-built ambulance Jeeps. These Holden Jeep ambulances, introduced during the Guadalcanal campaign, featured extended rear bodies, removable canvas roofs, and side racks for litters. Though produced in limited numbers, they became invaluable in evacuating wounded Marines from landing zones and forward aid posts to beachside hospitals. Reports from Marine medical units describe how these Jeeps could traverse flooded coral tracks and climb steep slopes that no truck could manage. Their engines were air-cooled quickly enough to withstand the tropical heat, and their small size allowed them to weave between palm trees and wreckage. When amphibious assaults created chaotic, shifting fronts, the stretcher Jeeps became the only consistent link between medics and field hospitals. At Cape Gloucester and Peleliu, drivers navigated through knee-deep mud and incoming fire to retrieve casualties who otherwise would have been left behind. Despite minimal protection, their casualty rates among drivers were relatively low, due largely to their speed and the ability to blend into terrain. On the other side of the world, the European theater presented entirely different challenges: cold, snow, and relentless artillery. During the Normandy campaign and the advance across France, the 3rd U.S. Army under General George S. Patton employed Jeep ambulances extensively in its forward medical units. The mobility of Patton's forces depended on rapid evacuation to keep soldiers cycling back into combat, and the heavy Dodge WC-54 ambulances could not always reach the front in time. Jeep conversions, equipped with stretcher racks, made it possible to move the wounded across narrow hedgerow paths and through bombed-out villages. Photographs from a European campaign show Jeep ambulances in use during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. In the forests of the Ardennes, where deep snow and shell craters blocked nearly every route, Jeeps outfitted with litter racks and tire chains continued to operate when larger vehicles could not. Some were fitted with improvised windshields of plexiglass scavenged from wrecked aircraft to shield patients from freezing air. Others were partially wrapped in canvas to protect against the cold. Army medics learned to preheat engines with gasoline torches before dawn evacuations, keeping the Jeeps ready for immediate deployment. Despite primitive conditions, these vehicles moved hundreds of wounded soldiers from exposed outposts to regimental aid stations during the worst weeks of the winter. The British Army and Commonwealth forces adapted the same concept. Airborne divisions that had landed in Normandy and later in the Netherlands used Jeep ambulances to evacuate paratroopers under fire. The compact size of the Willys MB made it the only motorized vehicle light enough to be airdropped with the troops. After the landings at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, British medical detachments used Jeep ambulances to shuttle wounded men from the bridgehead to improvised hospitals despite constant German fire. Reports from the Royal Army Medical Corps described the stretcher Jeeps as indispensable in situations where horses or human carriers had previously been the only options. As the war neared its end, Jeep ambulances continued to operate across multiple fronts, proving their worth through sheer persistence. They evacuated the wounded from the Siegfried Line, from the ruins of Cologne, and from the flooded lowlands of the Rhine crossings. Their reliability became legendary. Even when engines failed, the Jeeps could be pushed or towed by another vehicle, a flexibility larger ambulances lacked. Mechanics kept them running with salvage parts, spark plugs from tanks, fuel lines from generators, wheels from abandoned vehicles. War correspondents and military photographers occasionally captured them in motion, small, open-top vehicles bouncing through mud with two wounded men strapped above the hood, a driver hunched low, and a red cross fluttering in the wind. These images circulated in wartime journals and army publications, showing not the power of machines but the endurance of human will. They became quiet icons of the medical corps, a symbol of the soldiers who fought not to kill but to carry. By 1945, the stretcher Jeep had earned a reputation that extended beyond its improvised origins. It was no longer viewed as an emergency solution, but as an essential tool of mobile warfare. The lessons learned from its trials on both sides of the world, the jungle paths of the Pacific and the icy forests of Europe, would shape the future of battlefield medicine. Every successful rescue proved that mobility, not size or armor, was a key to saving lives. And on every front, these small, rugged machines demonstrated that even in war's most desolate landscapes, the will to save could find its own way forward, one wounded soldier at a time. By the final year of the war, what had begun as an emergency measure in scattered field workshops had transformed into a semi-official practice across multiple theaters. The improvisation that once defined a handful of mechanics now became an organized system of adaptation. The idea that a light utility vehicle could double as an ambulance spread rapidly through the Allied armies, carried by necessity, communication between units, and photographic documentation. What started as individual initiative evolved into a shared engineering language that transcended borders and branches of service. In the European theater, the adoption of the stretcher Jeep reached its height during the winter of 1944-45. The 3rd U.S. Army, fighting through the Ardennes and into the Rhineland, relied heavily on mobility to maintain its tempo of operations. As bridges were blown and supply convoys lagged behind, medics increasingly depended on Jeep ambulances to move the wounded from forward positions to battalion aid stations. Reports from these months describe entire medical platoons equipped exclusively with modified Jeeps, while heavier Dodge WC-54 ambulances remained farther to the rear. The combination of speed, maneuverability, and ease of repair made the Jeep the only practical evacuation vehicle for the fluid front lines of late-war Europe. The British Army, operating alongside American units, integrated the practice with typical precision. The Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REAM, developed a standard litter rack system that could be attached to any Willys or Ford Jeep within minutes. This modular design, fabricated from tubular steel and secured with quick-release fittings, allowed a Jeep to be converted back to its standard configuration when needed. The Canadians adopted a similar system and refined it for use in muddy or frozen terrain by adding stabilizing supports. These Commonwealth innovations, distributed through technical bulletins and engineering notes, ensured that the concept of the Jeep ambulance would persist long after the war ended. In the Pacific, the influence took on a more formal shape. The U.S. Marine Corps, working with Australian manufacturers, commissioned a limited production run of the Holden Jeep ambulance, built by General Motors Holden in Melbourne. These vehicles incorporated lessons learned from field improvisations, an extended chassis, a covered rear compartment, and side-mounted litter racks, creating the first purpose-built Jeep ambulances of the war. They served in campaigns from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, proving that a small, adaptable vehicle could meet the demands of tropical warfare. The success of the Holden conversions demonstrated how battlefield necessity could guide official design. By early 1945, the U.S. Army Medical Department had begun including references to Jeep ambulance conversions in its maintenance and operator manuals. The technical manual TM9 to 803, which outlined procedures for operating and maintaining the Willys MB and Ford GPW, included notes and diagrams showing stretcher mounts and safety considerations. Though these mentions were understated and did not constitute full standardization, they represented an acknowledgement from the institution that improvisation had become indispensable. The unofficial had become integrated into doctrine. The cultural impact within the armed forces was equally significant. The Jeep ambulance became a symbol of resourcefulness, a quiet victory of field ingenuity over bureaucratic delay. Its use blurred the line between combat and support roles, showing that any soldier with the right tools could alter the course of survival for his comrades. Mechanics and medics gained newfound respect as innovators rather than mere maintainers. For many, the Jeep ambulance represented a small but meaningful triumph of compassion amid the machinery of war. After 1945, the lessons learned from these wartime adaptations shaped post-war military vehicle design. When the Willys MB was succeeded by the M38 in 1950 and later by the M170 in 1953, both vehicles incorporated features that reflected the stretcher Jeep legacy. The M170, with its extended wheelbase and reinforced side mounts for two stretchers, became the first officially designated field ambulance Jeep in U.S. service. It was used extensively during the Korean War and continued in service through the Vietnam era. The evolution from improvised litter carriers to standardized production models showed how battlefield innovation could migrate upward into military industry and doctrine. The influence extended beyond the U.S. Army. Allied nations that had used the Jeep during the war, including France, the Netherlands, and Norway, continued to build or adapt light ambulances based on surplus Willys vehicles in the late 1940s. Civil defense organizations and post-war rescue services also adopted the design, recognizing its practicality in disaster zones and rugged rural areas. The concept had escaped its wartime origins and entered civilian life. By the end of the decade, the image of the Jeep ambulance, small, rugged, and unadorned, had become a familiar sight across continents. It stood as evidence of how necessity could redefine the purpose of technology. The influence of those wartime conversions persisted not because they were perfect, but because they embodied a principle that remained timeless, that the simplest machines, when guided by human creativity, could become instruments of mercy even amid destruction. Decades after the war ended, the legacy of the stretcher Jeep continued to speak to the few surviving examples preserved in museums and private collections. These machines, stripped of their engines or carefully restored to running condition, bore the marks of their origin. Their frames were scarred with welds and patches, the olive drab paint worn to bare metal in places, and the faint outlines of red crosses still visible beneath layers of dust. Each dent and repair told a story of improvisation and endurance. Unlike the pristine tanks and aircraft displayed in military museums, these Jeeps did not represent victory or power. They embodied something quieter and far more intimate, the ingenuity of men who refused to let necessity become fatalism. Several of these vehicles found their way into institutional collections. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans holds one of the best-preserved stretcher Jeeps, complete with its metal litter racks and hand-welded brackets. Another sits in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, where it represents the cooperation between American and Australian forces in the Pacific and the role of Holden's wartime production in adapting civilian industry to military innovation. In Kentucky, the Patton Armor Museum exhibits a reconstruction based on field photographs and original parts, allowing visitors to see how a standard Willys MB could be transformed into a life-saving machine with only basic tools and a few feet of tubing. These restorations serve not just as mechanical artifacts, but as educational symbols of adaptability under pressure. The endurance of these vehicles was remarkable. Even after years of neglect, their welded joints held firm, and their simple mechanical systems could be revived with minimal restoration. This durability mirrored the philosophy behind their creation, that simplicity and accessibility were the greatest strengths in the chaos of war. Mechanics and historians who examined surviving examples often noted that the modifications were not crude improvisations, but thoughtful solutions, guided by practical understanding of weight balance and field conditions. The welds, though rough, were placed precisely where structural stress demanded reinforcement. Every bracket, every bolt served a purpose. Beyond their physical preservation, the idea of the stretcher Jeep left a lasting imprint on military thinking. It demonstrated that design did not have to come from top-down planning or factory schematics. Some of the most effective wartime innovations were born from the field, through the immediate confrontation between problem and survival. This lesson influenced post-war engineering philosophy in both military and civilian sectors. When the U.S. Army later standardized the M170 field ambulance, it was not merely copying a successful design. It was acknowledging the principle that small, adaptive systems could fill critical logistical gaps more effectively than large, complex ones. In the years following World War II, surplus Jeeps continued to serve in humanitarian roles. In Europe and Asia, they were used by medical missions, civil defense units, and reconstruction agencies. In post-war France and the Netherlands, converted Jeeps carried wounded civilians through bombed cities and rural areas where larger ambulances could not travel. During the Korean War, the descendants of the wartime stretcher Jeeps reappeared in a new form, carrying the same spirit of field improvisation into another generation of conflict. Culturally, the stretcher Jeep became a symbol of modest heroism. It rarely appeared in wartime propaganda or post-war films, yet among veterans and medical corpsmen, it held deep respect. It represented the anonymous courage of those who repaired instead of destroyed, who built rather than retreated. In letters and memoirs, soldiers remembered the relief of hearing a Jeep's small engine approaching after hours of waiting in the mud. For many, that sound meant not just rescue, but the restoration of hope. Today, historians view the stretcher Jeep as part of a broader narrative about how technology and humanity intersected in total war. It stood at the crossroads between industrial mass production and individual craftsmanship, between the machinery of destruction and the instinct to preserve life. Its legacy endured not because it was glamorous, but because it was honest, a creation of necessity that revealed the resilience of human ingenuity. The few surviving Jeeps, displayed under museum lights, remain reminders that even in the most mechanized conflict in history, the simplest tools could become instruments of mercy. The story of the stretcher Jeep was not one of industrial triumph or strategic brilliance. It was a story of quiet defiance against the logic of war itself. In an age when steel was molded primarily to destroy, these machines became instruments of preservation. They were built from the same materials as weapons and vehicles of conquest, yet they serve an entirely different purpose. Their existence stood as proof that even amid the most mechanized conflict in human history, compassion could find expression through mechanics, and mercy could take the form of metal and grease. The men who created these ambulances did not work from blueprints or doctrine. They worked from an understanding deeper than any manual could provide, the instinct to save another life when every system around them was designed to take it. Their hands, stained with oil and mud, gave new purpose to the remnants of battle. They turned wreckage into rescue. Each weld, each bolt, was not an act of obedience but a conviction. It reflected a truth that soldiers rarely had time to articulate, that invention and empathy were often born from the same impulse, the refusal to accept loss as inevitable. In the larger machinery of war, the stretcher Jeep was insignificant. It did not decide campaigns or alter strategies. Yet, in its simplicity, it revealed the moral paradox of modern conflict, that humanity survived precisely because it refused to surrender to the scale of destruction it had created. The same technology that allowed armies to level cities also allowed a handful of mechanics to build a bridge between life and death, one wounded soldier at a time. It was a small reminder that progress and compassion could coexist, even in the mud of battlefields. The Jeeps themselves embodied an honesty that grander machines could not. They carried no armor, no prestige, and no illusions of glory. They were improvised, scarred, and uncomfortable, but they worked. Their success depended entirely on human skill and cooperation, qualities that war often sought to consume. To drive one of these ambulances was to participate in an act of resistance, not against an enemy, but against indifference. Every mile traveled, every soldier delivered to a field hospital, was a quiet victory over despair. After the war, their legacy persisted not only in the design of new vehicles, but in the mindset they inspired. They demonstrated that innovation did not always emerge from laboratories or command orders, but from individuals confronted with impossibility and choosing to act anyway. This philosophy would echo through future generations of soldiers, engineers, and doctors who learned that improvisation was not the enemy of discipline, but its most human form. In reflecting on these machines, one sees the essence of wartime ingenuity, not the pursuit of dominance, but the search for meaning amid destruction. The stretcher Jeep was a contradiction on wheels, a vehicle born of war that existed to oppose its consequences. It symbolized a fragile thread of decency that endured even as civilization tore itself apart. Long after the roar of artillery faded, the image of a small Jeep carrying the wounded through shattered landscapes remained one of the most enduring testaments to what humans could still choose to be. Ultimately, the stretcher Jeep was not just a machine. It was an idea that even in the darkest chapters of history, there were those who looked at the same materials of war and saw, instead of a weapon, a way home. In every dented frame and rusted weld, there lay the proof that compassion was not extinguished by conflict. It merely changed form, adapting like the Jeep itself to whatever terrain it faced. And on those ruined roads where everything else had been designed to destroy, these small machines carried something far greater than soldiers. They carried the last remaining evidence that humanity could still build, even out of ruins, a path back toward life.